Erik the Red wasn't from Chad. So this is the WeWuzzery delusion that set the standard for all the other utter low IQ nonsense, the claim that the Vikings were black. The pale-haired maniacs from Scandinavia, the men who wrote sagas about axe murdering their neighbours and paddled longships to America 1,000 years ago, years before Columbus, were in fact, you guessed it, from sub-Saharan Africa. The race revisionist fan club says so it must be true. Who started this nonsense? The whole thing starts with a couple of Netflix producers deciding, in their infinite wisdom, to cast a black woman as 𝐬𝐮𝐫𝐿 in Vikings Valhalla. Now don't get me wrong, I love a bit of fantasy, but when you're turning an epic Norwegian warlord into something that looks like it came out of a Nollywood blockbuster, it's not history anymore, it's pantomime. And of course, the internet ran with it. Suddenly we had overnight historians spouting off about the Blåmen in Old Norse texts, which in their minds means the Vikings were African. Blåmen literally meant blue men or dark foreigners, the Northmen's word for strangers they met abroad, like Moors or Ethiopians. It did not mean that Erik the Red was secretly from Chad. Now let's look at the facts. In 2020, a massive study was published in Nature where scientists sequenced the DNA of 442 skeletons from across the Viking world. You know what they found? The Vikings were, now sit down before you collapse from the revelation, Scandinavians. They clustered genetically with modern Norwegians, Swedes and Danes. There were signs of mixing, of course, because the Vikings didn't just raid, they shagged their way across Europe. They picked up a bit of Irish, a bit of British, some Southern European here and there. But no, they weren't secretly Zulus in horned helmets. The closest thing they had to African ancestry was probably the goat they nicked on the way to the Mediterranean. Take the Salmi ship burial in Estonia, 4 brothers and a cousin buried together after dying in battle on a raid. DNA analysis showed they were close Scandinavian kin. Real Vikings, real family, real bloodlines. So why is it then that not a single published Viking Age burial genome shows sub-Saharan African ancestry? And if you look at the traits, these men already carried the lactase persistence allele, meaning they could drink milk into adulthood and had pigmentation profiles consistent with modern Scandinavians, predominantly light skin, hair ranging blonde to brown to red, and plenty of blue-green eyes. Not exactly what you see in certain streaming reenactments. The whole Black Viking claim is so insulting. These were men who could row a ship across the North Sea in the middle of winter, leap ashore, burn your village, and be back home in time to sacrifice a goat to Odin. The truth is simple, Vikings were Scandinavian. But hey, give it 1,000 years, a Netflix deal, and suddenly every black man is a Viking. Doesn't matter if your ancestors were herding goats in the Sahara or chasing hyenas off a carcass. Now it's, we was Vikings. If you think the samurai were African, seek medical attention. So, while Europe was burning witches and arguing about the Pope, the Japanese had Sengoku Jidai, perfecting the art of killing each other with style. Warlords like Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, and Uesugi Kenshin built castles like stone mountains and sent their warbands clashing under banners in every valley. Out of this badassery rose the samurai, enforcers of clans like the Tokugawa and the Shimazu, men who lived and died by the sword, and occasionally by the spectacular hobby of disemboweling themselves when things went wrong, the way of the warrior. And then there was Yasuke, an African who arrived in Japan in 1579 with Jesuit missionaries. Nobunaga was fascinated, partly because Yasuke was unique, partly because half of Kyoto thought his skin had been painted and tried to scrub him down like a dirty wall. For about a year, he served Nobunaga. He was given a weapon, a stipend, maybe even a house. Now the fact that people conveniently ignore he was never samurai. No land, no crest, no hereditary status, Japanese records don't call him samurai, they call him a servant. When Nobunaga died in 1582, Yasuke disappears from history. A brief, remarkable cameo. But of course, in the internet age, that tiny footnote has been inflated into the Black Samurai. Entire books and documentaries sell it. Social media runs with it. Video games like Nioh and anime series reimagine him as if he was on par with Tokugawa Ieyasu. Netflix even made him the star of a whole cartoon. History as valid as the X-22 report. You know, the one that's always promising Trump's secret return any day now, forever. The genetics nail the coffin shut anyway. A 2021 study explains, our data provide evidence of a tri-ancestry structure for present-day Japanese populations. Since then, this tripartite ancestry structure has been maintained in the archipelago and become the genetic foundation of modern Japanese no sub-Saharan input. None. You can dig up every burial mound in Honshu and you won't find one samurai skull clustering with Nigeria. Unless you think haplogroups are racist, the genetics kill this fantasy stone dead. If you want to cosplay, fine, swing a plastic sword at Comic-Con and call yourself a samurai. But of course, out go the Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun. Out go Nobunaga, Tokugawa, and the blood-soaked chronicles. In comes the bedtime story, WeWuzzery. Basalt, not black, the Olmec head myth. So, who really carved those giant Olmec heads? Africans in rowboats, or the people who actually lived there? The Americas, 15,000 years ago, vast herds of mammoth, endless forest, and then a small band of Siberian foragers stride into a new world, crossing over from Asia. That's the real start of Native American history, because apparently we're now being told it was actually Africans who rowed across the Atlantic just to chisel 12-foot Olmec basalt heads with fat lips and flat noses, then disappear without leaving so much as a canoe behind. How convenient. Yet somehow on the internet the first Americans have become the latest recruits to the Afrocentric Hall of Fame. No ethnicity is safe. Apparently the genetic story, the archaeology, the mounds, the maze, all of it was black. And you sit there watching this crap thinking, Jesus Christ, people believe this. Do they actually believe this? Whole YouTube channels with millions of views, demented faces telling you the Olmec heads are ancient Africans, and you can see the audience nodding along, dumbfounded, like they've all had a collective lobotomy. It's like Tony Blair doesn't need digital IDs. Just give people Wi-Fi and a half-baked conspiracy, and they'll hand over their brains on a paper plate. And the ringleader of this circus, 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐿, a Guyanese scholar whose 1976 book They Came Before Columbus claimed Africans sailed to the Americas and taught the locals civilization. This is the intellectual standard we're dealing with. A man so desperate to prove Africa built everything that he turned Olmec stone heads into selfies of his mates. The book has been shredded by archaeologists and geneticists for decades, but it still gets waved around like gospel by people who've never read past the title. Anyway, the myth-making always begins the same way. Look at the Olmec heads. They've got broad noses, must be African. And no, they've got the faces of the people who carved them, Mesoamericans. If you want to see Africa in every round cheek and wide jaw, that's on you, not on the basalt. Meanwhile, what does the science say? Ancient DNA studies produce the facts. The Handbook of North American Indians explains that the genetic evidence indicates a founding population derived from northeastern Asia. That's it. Not Africa, not Atlantis, northeastern Asia. When researchers sequenced the 12,600-year-old 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐿 child in Montana, they found exactly the same thing. The 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐿 child is consistent with deriving all of his ancestry from the same founding population as Central and South Americans. And the broadest sweep of the data laid out by Skoglund and Reich 2016 hammers the final nail in the coffin. All Native Americans derive from a single founding population that diverged from East Asians around 25,000 years ago. 3 independent lines of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. Native Americans came from Asia, not the Congo, not Mali, not Zambia. Asia. They were Asians who crossed Beringia and stayed. You're not uplifting Native Americans by claiming they were Africans, you complete imbeciles. Imagine explaining to the Maya that their pyramids don't belong to them. They were just caretakers for some mystery Gambian voyagers who vanished without a trace. And if you turned up claiming to be them, you wouldn't be welcomed into the tribe. You'd be stripped naked, tied to a stake, and watching your still beating heart get offered to the gods while the drums pounded. And somehow, after all that, you'd still be daft enough to say it with a straight face. We was Native Americans. The great white playwright they want to paint over. When England was England, a town of muddy streets, timbered houses, sheep fields, and the stink of tanneries drifting down the lanes. Out of this world came William Shakespeare, son of John the Glovemaker and Mary Arden, a farmer's daughter. Just a white Warwickshire boy with ink on his fingers who would go on to dominate world literature. Honestly, sometimes being English feels like a cheat code. And dominate he did. Hamlet gave us a prince so indecisive, he takes 4 acts to kill his uncle, and in the meantime stabs the wrong man hiding behind a curtain. Macbeth handed us a Scottish warlord, stupid enough to take career advice from 3 old crones round a cauldron. And honestly, who in their right mind builds a kingdom on the words of witches, and then spend his reign seeing ghosts at dinner like a lunatic? King Lear put an aging monarch centre stage, removed from his kingdom by 2 treacherous daughters, while the one honest child got shoved aside. Proof, if you needed it, that bad parenting is timeless. But apparently, we've all been reading him wrong, because according to the race studies priesthood, forever converting facts into dogma, people like 𝐼𝐿𝐵𝐿𝐵, who insists Shakespeare must be read through colonial and racial lenses, Kim F. Hall, who claimed Elizabethan England was already obsessed with race and blackness, and Ayanna Thompson, who treats the Bard as a stage for modern identity politics. The great Bard of Avon wasn't English at all. He was clearly black, the sub-Saharan kind. Yes, the man whose bust still sits in Holy Trinity Church, alabaster-faced, with his receding hairline carved in stone, was apparently a lost son of Africa. What utter codswallop. What the actual texts tell us is very different. The Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare and Race quotes verse of the time. Choose rubies out until thou match thy lips, pearl till thy teeth, and ivory till thy skin be matched in whiteness, but that will never be. Whiteness was beauty. Paleness was ideal. This wasn't subversive. It was the standard of the world Shakespeare breathed every day. And look at how he used imagery himself. When Romeo first sees Juliet, he gushes, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night, like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear." So shows a snowy dove trooping with crows. Juliet is a pearl against darkness, a snowy dove among crows. That isn't Shakespeare slipping in some secret black pride. It's him hammering home the cultural obsession with white beauty. Meanwhile, the evidence of Shakespeare's own life is overwhelming. We have the Droeshout engraving in the first folio, the Chandos portrait, the Stratford funerary bust. They all show the same pale, balding Englishman. Unless the Elizabethans had Photoshop and decided to whitewash him in advance, what you see is what you got. William Shakespeare's plays already tower over almost everything else written in English. If you want to celebrate him, read Hamlet. If you want to dress like him, wear a ruff. But if you want to rewrite him into a black nationalist bedtime story, what exactly are you celebrating? Shakespeare or yourself? But of course, we was Bill Shakespeare. The Ministry of Ridiculous Histories presents WeWuzzery Berbers. Spain, 711. A bunch of Visigoths are squabbling like idiots, and across the water comes an army of Berbers from Morocco, led by Arab generals who actually know how to read a map. They smash the Visigoths, take the land, and for centuries turn Iberia into Al-Andalus, a mix of palaces, libraries, mosques, and the odd public beheading. These were the Moors, North African, Arab, Berber, the lot. Berbers, the people who've been hanging around Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia for thousands of years. And honestly, since when did hanging around North Africa translate into straight outta Compton? They were dark-skinned in the same way Italians are dark-skinned after 2 weeks on holiday in Marbella. Not Zulus, not Yoruba, not anything you'd find in an NWA video. The genetics make this crystal clear. As one study put it, using SNP data from 2,099 individuals in 43 populations, we show that estimates of recent shared ancestry between Europe and Africa are substantially increased when gene flow from North Africans rather than sub-Saharan Africans is considered. The gradient of North African ancestry accounts for previous observations of low levels of sharing with sub-Saharan Africa and is independent of recent gene flow from the Near East. As one PNAS study by Bottigue et al. In 2013 put it, translation, if you think the Moors were black Africans, congratulations, you failed GCSE biology. The actual genetic link is North Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa barely registers unless you're talking about the odd slave brought across the desert on the back of a camel. And let's be honest, that's not exactly a mass migration, is it? And just to hammer the point home, the same study drops this gem. Genetically diverged from sub-Saharan populations. For example, the Moorish Berber conquest in Iberia began in the 8th century Common Era and lasted for more than 500 years. This conquest has been suggested as a potential source of gene flow from North Africa toward the Iberian Peninsula. The Y chromosome haplogroup E3b2m 81 distribution is in agreement with recent North African gene flow at that period. In other words, the DNA agrees with the history books. It's Berber fingerprints all over Iberia, not the ghost of Mansa Musa showing up with a caravan of gold. Haplogroup E-M81 is practically a Berber calling card. It's not found in sub-Saharan Africa in any meaningful frequency, but it is absolutely dominant in North Africa. That's the genetic equivalent of a giant neon sign saying these were Maghrebi people, not Nigerians. The Berbers, conquerors, not saints, not enlightened multicultural mascots, just guys with swords and a plan. In 711, 𝐷𝐴𝐴 ibn Ziyad didn't bring civilization. He dragged an army across the strait, kicked the Visigoths' teeth down their throats, and said, "Yeah, we live here now." Sure, they built some palaces, wrote some poetry, and figured out how to move water without praying. Great. But the rest of the time, they were cutting each other's heads off over which cousin got to wear the crown that week. Al-Andalus was a schizophrenic circus, algebra lectures in the afternoon, knife fights in the alley by sunset. So next time someone parrots the Moors were black line, just remember, the DNA, the haplogroups, the archaeology, it's all pointing north of the Sahara, not south. And still, after all that evidence, you'll still hear, "We was Berbers."